Oh, hi there. Do you know the Gospels can be synchronized into one epic compilation? And here it is. Want to find out how? Well, stay tuned and let's get into it. Here's the question. Why is it such a challenge to synchronize the four Gospels into chronological order? The main problem we encounter is that the Gospel writer's primary concern is not a strict chronology, but rather a topical arrangement of stories that produces an intended context. These differing contexts are the foundation for the specific teaching God desired that writer to convey about Jesus and his role as the second person in the Trinity. The Gospel authors are more concerned about grouping stories together that will assist in producing sound theological doctrine than they are about placing the events of Jesus' life in exact chronological order. So depending on what topic they are trying to teach, stories will be mentioned accordingly. Luke says in the introduction to his Gospel, in chapter 1 verse 3, "Since I myself have investigated everything with a careful review from start to finish, it seemed fitting that I write my own orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." Firstly, Luke explains that he has gone through a thorough and exhaustive investigation concerning the earthly life of Jesus from start to finish. And because of this, it seems fitting that he sort them all together, as he knows it will be an extremely accurate account. If we backtrack one verse to Luke 1 verse 2, Luke indicates that he conducted this careful review by interviewing all the primary reputable eyewitnesses, stating that the primary source material of all these events he documented were handed down to him from these key witnesses. Secondly, Luke seems to indicate here in verse 3 that he has written an orderly or successive account for Theophilus. But when you study out Luke's Gospel, you find that it is not very chronological at all. But here's the key. Verse 4 of Luke chapter 1 states that he put together this accurate report to help Theophilus gauge the authenticity of the things he had been taught with greater certainty. So when Luke says in the introduction of his Gospel that he is writing an orderly account for Theophilus, he is not referring to chronological order, but a book that is orderly in the sense that it is filled with meaningful sequences arranged topically that will help Theophilus gain even greater confidence in the truth he'd already heard about Jesus. So that's why in Gospel Sync, I translated the Greek word here for orderly as sequential, because in my opinion, that more accurately depicts the purpose behind why Luke used this word. Now, within the four Gospels, we do find a soft chronology. For example, you're not going to find the death of Jesus before the baptism of Jesus. Or you're not going to find the ministry of Jesus before he's born. So you can break the soft chronology up into three main segments. The first one consists of the birth or introduction, depending on the Gospel, right up until Jesus' water baptism. The second segment consists of the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus. That would be from Jesus' water baptism all the way up to Palm Sunday. And the third and final segment consists of Passion Week, the resurrection, and the ascension. So Passion Week is Palm Sunday, or the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on the donkey, all the way through to Holy Saturday, when Jesus was in the grave. And then you have the resurrection and the ascension. So that's segment number 3. It's primarily within the 3.5-year ministry of Jesus, so the second segment, that you find things out of chronological order in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, when I say Synoptic Gospels, what do I mean? The Synoptic Gospels are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which describe events from a similar point of view, as contrasted with that of John. So you've got 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason they are synoptic is because they describe events from a similar point of view. And then you have John, which is all the way out here on its own, because he comes from a completely different point of view than the other 3. But even the word synoptic in the English dictionary means forming a general summary. So a synoptic account of someone's life is a generalised summation. It doesn't have to be exactly specific in every single way. So this gives leeway for the gospel writers to change the order of events to highlight theological doctrines that are far more important. But this generalisation does not in any way suggest that the accounts are not accurate. The scriptures are infallible, meaning they're 100% accurate. It is impossible for them to have error. All the gospel writers have specific points about Jesus that the Father wants them to convey to their specific audience. And then by extension, God uses these unique differences or vantage points to convey an exhaustive compilation of truth to all humanity about the earthly life of his uniquely divine Son, as is found in the Holy Bible. So now let's look at the way I arranged the chronology of these 4 Gospels and synchronise them into one compilation. But before I do, a quick disclaimer. I didn't undertake this project to replace the Gospels in their separate form. I completed it merely as a study tool to be used alongside them. First, let's start with the Gospel of John. Now, I believe this Gospel is the only one that is fully chronological. So you think to yourself, this is great. I've got the foundation of the chronology for the entire project. But hang on a minute. Within that 3.5 year where Jesus outworks his ministry, there's only one story in the book of John that is mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. So during the period where all the confusion is with regard to chronology, John is almost useless in helping us determine which stories come in which order. Now, besides this one story inside the ministry of Jesus, John meets up with the other Gospels 6 days before the Passover, or 1 day before Palm Sunday or the Triumphal Entry. So from here onwards, we can use John as the basis for the chronology, but prior to this, we have to find another strategy. So now let's shift our focus across to the Gospel of Luke. He's the only Gentile of the 4 Gospel writers, and he accompanied Paul on many of his missionary journeys. And that's why he also wrote the book of Acts, because he was actually an eyewitness to a lot of the latter part of the book of Acts. Paul even states in Colossians 4 verse 14 that Luke was a doctor. So I guess he had a medical student type of mind. And Luke had to have known Mary, the mother of Jesus, or at the very least interviewed her, because she was Luke's key eyewitness for chapters 1 and 2, which are not found in the other Gospels. As I hinted at previously, Luke is the least chronological of all the 4 Gospels, even though he states it's orderly. I refer to it as the cut and paste Gospel. So it's like he had a computer and he's just like cutting and pasting the stories all over the place and mixing and matching them all over and just jumbling them all up. Obviously, he's not doing it randomly. He has a purpose. As I've explained earlier, it's topical, it's sequential, and it's for Theophilus to understand with greater clarity the things concerning Jesus. And one of these, the funniest examples where it just seems so random is in Luke 16. You have a story about a shrewd manager, and then you have a story about the rich man and Lazarus. It's as if Luke had these few verses left, some verses about the law and the prophets prophesy until John, and that the law is not going to disappear, and this one random verse about divorce, and he's just like, well, I've got this left, where am I going to put him? I'll just slap him in the middle of Luke 16 in between the parable of the shrewd manager and the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And that'll do. Now, obviously he didn't do that. It seems like he did that, but he obviously had a purpose for it. But it's just the nature of the Gospel of Luke. It seems to be haphazard and all over the place, although it's purposeful. For this reason, I can never use the Gospel of Luke as the basis for any of the chronology, but I have to just scatter the stories within as they line up with the others. If you look at the referencing tables that I've included at the back of Gospel Sync, you'll see that Luke is all over the place. The first few chapters are seemingly in order, and then after that it becomes a bit of a dog's breakfast. Now, you might think I'm giving Luke a bit of a hard time here, but I want to tell you that actually the Gospel of Luke is by far my favourite Gospel. It's always been that way since the first time I read it as a new Christian. I remember trying to read the Gospel of John for the first time and going through like John chapter 3 about being born again. And I just remember going, what in the world does this mean? I don't have a clue what he's talking about. And I'd just been born again. I literally got born again. But then I read the chapter about being born again, had no understanding. I had no spiritual discernment back then. And I didn't know I couldn't understand it. But then I'd go into Luke and I'd find that it really related to me and I could understand some of the practicalities and the stories were interesting to me. But here are the reasons why the Gospel of Luke has maintained the title of being my favourite Gospel even to this day. Towards the end of Luke chapter 9, just after Jesus sets out resolutely with his face firmly set towards Jerusalem for the last time, he's going to go there, you have the scripture where Jesus says, "He that puts his hand to the plough and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God." And that's exclusive to Luke. And then from there all the way through to chapter 19, you discover the most amazing exclusive content, including some of the most cherished and much loved stories, along with the best practical advice you can find. So what are some of the examples of these much loved stories that are only found in Luke? What about the Good Samaritan? The prodigal son? The parable of the woman with the lost coin? The parable about the shrewd manager? The story about the rich man and Lazarus? What about the Pharisee and the tax collector? Were they both praying in the temple and the Pharisee says, "Look, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, not like robbers or evildoers or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tithe of everything I get." But the tax collector just bowed his head to the ground and said, "Lord, reconcile me, a sinner." And that tax collector went home justified before God, and the Pharisee didn't go home justified before God. What about Jesus at the home of Mary and Martha? When Martha was doing all the cooking and she was getting angry at Mary because she was sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to what he had to say. Then you have the healing of the 10 lepers, if you remember, where only the Samaritan came back praising God in a loud voice. What about Zacchaeus who climbs up the sycamore fig tree? These are all amazing stories that are exclusively found in the Gospel of Luke. Now what about practical advice? How about this? Life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. When you're invited to a banquet, take the lowest place. Then there's the story Jesus told about the man who stored up wealth in barns. And Jesus said that his life would be demanded of him because he stored up wealth for himself without being rich towards God. What about sitting down and counting the cost before you become Jesus' disciple? And the passage from Luke 17:10, which says, "So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty.'" Then there's the parable of the persistent widow, where Jesus shows us that we should always pray and never give up. So Luke truly is the most awesome gospel in my opinion. It's just not all that great for the purpose of gospel synchronization. But I can forgive him for that. Hi, I'm back. You know, there is actually one passage in Luke that is critical to compiling a correct gospel chronology, but you'll have to wait to part 2 to find out. Once released, that video will appear right up here. By the way, we'll also cover Matthew and Mark, head back briefly to John, and then arrive at the final outcome as to how I synchronise the 4 Gospels. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope I'll see you again soon.